Our commentator today is Susan Carroll Rogers. Susan Carroll Rogers is an associate professor of anthropology at New York University. She's held numerous posts, visiting posts in France. She is the author of an extraordinary number of articles. I lost count at 35, but I think it goes north of that figure. She's edited several volumes and has penned two monographs, the latest of which is entitled Shaping Modern Times in Rural France, the Transformation and Reproduction of an Aveyronnais Community. Please.
Thank you very much, and thanks especially to the panelists for a really interesting and stimulating set of papers. I have to say, as an anthropologist interested in agricultural development in contemporary France, I found these forays into past efforts to shape and manage the environment to be especially thought-provoking. My comments are suggested by these papers, but they really have more to do with ideas that occurred to me as I read them for things that I'd be interested in seeing elaborated in longer versions of the paper. We're all quite aware of the limitations of the 10 pages. So I'd first like to note at the outset, as Joseph reminded us, that Brodel's legacy clearly weighs heavy on environmental history generally, and all the more so in the Mediterranean. I think it's undoubtedly the case that no one would dispute the importance of the longue durée in understanding various dimensions, various environmental dimensions of French history. But these three papers draw our attention usefully, it seems to me, to the kinds of insights to be gained from a focus on shorter-term events and interventions. Insights about the history of human efforts, here especially in the form of state interventions, to manage or shape natural environments, as well as the limitations on such efforts. That comes through clearly. One familiar argument that's most forcefully developed in Cindy's paper, alluded to in Joe's and present more in the breach in Joshua's, is the notion that one important indicator or vector of state formation or the consolidation of state power has to do with the effectiveness with which it intervenes in the natural world, or at least with people's expectations or acceptance that it will or should intervene. And certainly the French example of a highly centralized and powerful state as it emerges during the period of interest here provides really interesting case material for that. But I would like to sound a cautionary note here about generalizing too hastily from the French example. That, in other words, I think we need to be a little careful about pushing too far to the edges the possibility of other kinds of agents besides a powerful centralized state that may account for substantial human interventions in the environment, either in the absence of such a state or in addition to it. So I'm a little skeptical, and this may be my anthropology popping out here, but a little skeptical about trying to trace a general history of human interaction with the environment that's too tightly or inevitably bound to the history of the state. Anyway, I think so that's kind of the direction that I want to move my comments in. Now, Cindy, I'm going to go out of order a little bit, but Cindy makes an interesting and compelling case with respect to the plague sweeping across Provence in the early 18th century. And she shows us that the central state has, by this moment, acquired the power, the resources, and the legitimacy to intervene with respect to imposing quarantines and other public health measures, as well as relief efforts. And what's interesting to me is that the novelty here isn't so much what they're doing as the fact that they're displacing local or regional authorities in doing it. So, and she makes a very persuasive case that that episode marks a telling moment in the consolidation of a centralized state power in France. My guess is that that history isn't really an unbending linear march in a consistent direction, even in France, but the kind of tracking of who is expected to intervene how in the context of natural disasters seems to me a really interesting focus that she draws our attention to, not only in the case of the history of the French state, but also, as she suggests, more broadly. The broader question she poses is intriguing, but again, I'm a little skeptical about the prospects of constructing a kind of universal history here. I'd be more cautious about generalization, even to the rest of Europe, from France, than she seems to be suggesting. I'm not so sure that there's anything specifically or generally modern or Western about the expectation that a powerful centralized state could or should be an appropriate counter to nature run amok. Rather, it seems to me that it's really worthwhile to ask where, when, and under what conditions are people inclined to look to a centralized state, to centralized state agencies for such intervention. And by the same token, when, where, and under what conditions do other forms of salvation seem more plausible, more legitimate, or reliable? So when are people more inclined to look to spiritual answers or foreign powers? I'm thinking here, not to be anachronistic, but in the case of the Haitian earthquake, it seemed perfectly normal and expected and totally legitimate to get help from foreign sources, whereas in the case of Katrina, it was deeply humiliating and embarrassing that anybody would suggest that we needed any kind of foreign aid. Or where is non-governmental aid or commercial considered legitimate and reliable? And there I want to ask who exactly are the we that gets referred to in Cindy's paper. We expect the central state or whoever. I suspect that we're not talking about human beings everywhere, but that it's much more specific to particular places and times. Anyway, it seems to me that whether we're looking at the 18th century or the 21st, the question posed by Cindy is an interesting one. But again, I'd suggest that it might be short-circuited if we assume some kind of universal linear progression or the inevitable centralized state. Now, the other two papers focus more on episodes that remind us of some of the limits of human intervention in the environment. Although Joseph again evokes the idea that human intervention in the environment increases with the consolidation of a centralized state. And I'd be a little cautious about that. The notion that the centralized state is necessarily more privileged agent than others in this matter. He's also suggesting, though, another kind of caution that seems to me well taken here, namely that the forces of nature don't necessarily submit readily to even exceptionally powerful states or sophisticated expertise. And I think that's a lesson that we are continually having to be reminded of into the present day. He provides an interesting example of the attempt to introduce cotton production to southern France, and noting that it rested on a strongly held belief in the human capacity, armed with sufficient scientific knowledge and political will, to shape the natural environment. And again, it's really interesting to see that idea so forcefully present in the historical period he's talking about, because it's not really an unfamiliar idea in the present day, I would say. So in this case, he's focusing primarily in this paper. He's focusing primarily on the motivations and interventions of Napoleon's regime, and arguing very compellingly that the particular effort he's describing to turn southern France's agricultural resources to cotton production was clearly driven largely by geopolitical interests, And the same can be said for the abandonment of the effort by the restored Bourbon regime 6 years later. It was equally driven by geopolitical interests. But he suggests that in the paper that this experiment also depended on convincing landowners in the area to put their resources to new uses. And there, presumably, although it's not developed in this particular version of the paper, but there's presumably a whole array of interests and motivations that associated with agricultural decision making that come into play, and that clearly were not fully controlled by even a very powerful state. Okay, so that the decision in the end, the decision of certain landowners to produce cotton or not to produce cotton, presumably were not driven primarily by geopolitical interests, but by some other kinds of interests that merit more attention than he had room for in this paper. I find that idea of essentially what's happening here is that the use of kind of demonstration plots of cotton production in an effort to persuade local landowners to adopt this new use of the environment. It evokes a very common practice in 19th century American agricultural production that's not always that successful. To bring about a change. And here you have the idea of agriculture as a kind of spectator sport, where people make decisions based on what they observe going on around them, and that's very difficult to fully control or manage those kinds of decisions. So it seems to me in a longer paper it would be worth exploring those human constraints on state powers to manage the environment to add that in. It doesn't diminish the importance of the main point that was made ultimately in this paper, that's also certainly well taken, again, that nature doesn't readily or inevitably bow to even the most powerful or rational of human forces, right? But there's a kind of it's not only nature that's constraining what can happen here. Joshua's paper dealing with the curious case of Corsica it kind of comes at the problem in an interestingly similar in different ways. Clearly, his example of Corsica is strategic from the perspective of the French state because of its location. His paper also is primarily focusing on the kind of perspective of the state. And what he's trying to explain is how come the state did not intervene in ways that might be expected and in fact can be observed in other parts of France at the same time. So the argument seems to rest on a kind of normative expectation that the French state ought to have managed and shaped Corsica's natural resources, and especially timber, in a way that was profitable, presumably to the state. And then he's posing the question, why didn't this happen? Now, one obvious answer is because it wasn't profitable to certain other actors who, in this particular context, turned out to be more powerful than that powerful state. Okay, the state, whether it's the French state or the other powers coming earlier, seem continually to be stymied by the local forces and their version, perspectives of their interests in how to use this natural environment. So there's at least an implicit reference here to the idea that forest management was really a key piece of state formation in 18th and 19th century France. A number of people have made that argument quite persuasively. But again, it's another domain that's shaped by sharply competing interests between the crown, between local elites, between local peasants, each of whom have different ideas about legitimate and profitable ways of using, in this case, forest resources. What seems notable about the Corsica case, if I understand it correctly, is the absence of much active intervention on the part of the French state or the British or Genoese to shape or exploit that forest or other natural resources. There's a number of proposals made, but very little action is apparently. So that, again, the preferred uses by local populations seem to persist relatively unchallenged. So here I would be interested in seeing more attention to the various interests and forms of profit that appeal to the different players that might provide a more satisfying example to the question of why the dog didn't bark in the end, right? But in any case, one point to be taken from this case is, again, the limits of state powers and also of state interests in dealing with natural resources. That's, I think, what this case adds. The state interests seem to have been defeated by local interests here. It also draws attention to the variable value of particular resources as you move from one context to another. We're used to hearing about how crucially important timber was in 17th and 18th century France, but it's perhaps not absolutely so. The Corsican context gives us an example where the absence of infrastructure made timber of limited value, at least from the perspective of the state. But it's also a case where presumably the costs of developing that infrastructure were outweighed by the perceived benefits, again from the perspective of the state. So that it draws attention to the shifting contexts that are going to change the meaning of these particular natural resources. All three of these papers, and Joshua's in the breach, offer specific episodes that provide, I think, really interesting tools for thinking about the history of state efforts to manage and control the natural environment. Again, the France of this period is a terrific case for exploring that issue. But I would like to see in more elaborated developments of this wonderful material a little more attention to the example of a strong state as one among other kinds of agents acting on the environment, and a little more attention made to the notion that even where there is a strong centralized state as an important player, it's likely to be working in concert with or in competition with other kinds of human agents. It seems to me that this set of papers would be even further enriched by a little more attention to that side of the equation. So I'd like to stop there.
Thank you, Susan, for that illuminating remark. Would you like to throw it? We have about 15 minutes left, so would you like to throw it open for questions? Is that, you want to take particular responses? I mean, we don't have too much time. I would sort of suggest we throw
questions. Yeah, let's do questions. Yeah.
So we will take questions. Just a couple of things. You do need to use the microphone while asking a question. That's not to amplify your voice in the theater, so please speak up. It's really so it can be recorded as part of the recording. Thank you. Would you like to go first?
Oh, yes, thank you very much. I enjoyed the papers and the comments. I kind of would like to echo your comments because let me just make a point about Cindy's paper. I know you probably know the Cipolla book on the plague in Tuscany, and I thought that the strength of that book was that it emphasized the resistance of certain authorities to state interventionism. And I'm sure that maybe it's the nature of the documents that you're looking at. I think in all three cases that we're looking at it from above. But what would make it a much more interesting paper, I thought it was interesting, by the way, but what would make more nuanced would be, I would like to hear, for example, what was the role of the religious authorities? And what about all the local officials? I mean, since we know that watering the streets and dumping things in ladder and drenching them in cider vinegar doesn't do anything to stop the plague, some people at the time must have been saying, what are you doing and why are you burning that building and what's happening to our commerce? I mean, that's what occurred to me. And you know what, I just want to know, what was the plague that was there? What was it?
It was mostly bubonic. There were Yersinia pestis. There were cases of pneumonic plague, but most of it was in the form of the bubonic.
Okay, so it was septicemic then?
Well, it was not septicemic.
It was not?
That I can tell based on the symptomology described in the documents. I haven't found evidence for septicemic, but I have found definitely evidence for pneumonic.
Okay, so it
And
was...
bubonic, of course, which is the most obvious.
Okay, all right. So that was interesting. So do we know where it came from?
Yes, it came from a ship called the Grand Saint-Antoine that had been away for a year and arrived back in the port of Marseille in May of 1720. And rather, it had actually been gathering silks and cotton bales, in fact, abroad, and brought them back from the Levant to sell them in the Foire de Beaucaire.
Okay.
Comment s'appelle? Beaucaire, thank you. And which was a huge fair in the south of France. And there happened to be some major municipal magistrates in Marseille that had a very vested interest in selling these goods in the foire. And therefore, the ship did not undergo the usual quarantining times or stops along the way in the islands that surround the city of Marseille before coming into port. So it managed to make it into the port at Pomègue, by skipping several steps. There might even been deaths on board.
It's ironic, I thought, that the state official would argue that processions are a good idea when you're setting up sanitary cordons to isolate people from each other. Okay, yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, please.
So thanks to all of you. This was a great panel. I had a smaller question for Josh and a meta question. I also noted a lot of hands, so maybe we can keep moving. So I have a small question for Joshua. It sounds like, I guess I want to offer a skeptical reading of the conclusions. Sorry, not Joshua, Joseph.
Oh, no.
Joseph, sorry, my apologies. Joseph,
Start paying attention here.
of the acclimatization document. That in certain ways, I'm not that surprised that, on one hand, the person that you're talking about admits some failures and setbacks and problems, but ultimately each year he talks about growing cotton and so forth. But given that the funding is coming from the state, it's not that surprising that there's a lot of optimism in there. So I wonder about reading those statements about acclimatization and the so-called successive cotton critically in terms of kind of scientific truth about how cotton is doing, given the political economy of the experiments. So I'm interested in the response to that. The broad question is, I think there's a lot of French environmental historians in the room, and I would love to hear the three of you speak a little bit more about how paying attention to environmental history helps us rethink and retell the history of France. History of modern France, early modern France, the 18th century specifically. We can think here in terms of narratives. We could think in terms of periodization. Honestly, I would get a little frustrated about how environmental history often gets marginalized. And so I would love to hear you be bold about, how this challenges some of the assumptions, narratives, periodizations, actors, etc. in history of early modern France.
Thank you for your question. So to answer, I think I'll start by answering your question. So, your caution is definitely merited because, you can even see his, I guess you'd say, sycophantic approach when he's talking about the great and august Napoleon in his documents. So, you do have to take all of these with a grain of salt. And to be honest, the quantities that he was producing, even if he was honest, they weren't comparable to, say, what you'd get in Georgia or something. So that's definitely the case. That said, I mean, there's so many. It was a project that encompassed the entire south of France, from Bordeaux to Var, and then into Italy as well. So you have thousands of people participating, and I think for this paper I focus on one individual, but I think that does kind of serve as a control. In some ways we can kind of balance what everyone is saying to get a general perspective, which I do in my dissertation. They also sent back cotton to Paris, which you can still find if anyone's interested. The F10 series in the National Archives has, the boxes have little samples of cotton that have been preserved for 200 years there. So, I have held it and touched the cotton that was grown there. So it's not, it's definitely a case in point. I mean, you always have to, read these from the perspective of kind of a critical eye on their efforts to acquire funding and so on, but I think it can be controlled. To your other question, maybe I'll just start with one statement I would make, just one example. It doesn't really come out in this paper. The narrative we get of French industrialization is often one that privileges kind of their secondary role vis-a-vis the British. And you definitely see that obviously with the failure of Napoleon's continental system. But in other writings and other parts of my dissertation, I talk, for example, about cotton cultivation in Saint-Domingue, which was in the late 18th century far advanced over any other part of the Americas. It was basically from the 1760s or so until the Haitian Revolution, the leading center of cotton production in the Caribbean. It was supporting the French industrialization. The French explicitly, as they were attempting to catch up in the 1780s to the British, who had a head start, they explicitly said, our advantage is going to be our Caribbean colonies and getting this cheaper. And actually a lot of the Saint-Domingue cotton was smuggled into Jamaica. So it went to actually feed the British industrial complex. And there wasn't, so it kind of closes the gap a little bit, I would say. And then obviously the Haitian Revolution kind of destroys that, which is why they tried to grow it in France. But at least for a moment in the late 18th century, we see France much closer to catching up with the British cotton industry than we often would see. So I think this is one area where environmental history can alter the narrative we get there. I can let my co-panelists probably have other examples.
If I may. Yeah, just a broader statement. The importance of the environment transcends time and place. And you are right that it has been marginalized, much as environmental issues are currently marginalized in general, just in current events and just in the way that we do things. And that's a problem because in particular looking at environmental history, we have the opportunity to look at these moments in time that can be extraordinarily instructive, that can be very telling, and that ideally we can learn from and incorporate today. And I would say that environmental history is marginalized because the importance of the environment in our everything today, in our politics, in our diplomacy, in our everyday lives is marginalized, unfortunately, in general.
Would you like to add?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, honestly, for me, it's something that I'm guilty of, right? I did marginalize environmental history in my dissertation. It was part of the dissertation when I took it out. But one of the reasons why I'm coming back to it, and I think this actually goes to your comment as well, is one of the things I'm really interested in is trying to get at the perspective of some of the other actors in the Mediterranean, especially. The smaller powers, politically, but a lot of times that's difficult to get at exactly what's going on. Very much subsumed by a lot of the major power dialogue. So the environment then offers us maybe you could even say a subaltern way to look at some of these narratives, some of these minor power, these stories. The stories of the Corsicans, they don't feature in much documentation, but if you look at the environmental side of things, you can get that other side of the story, I guess, and that is something that I definitely take that criticism of the paper, that I don't do that in the paper, but that is, I think, one of the strengths that environmental history can bring is exactly what you say there.
Subaltern goats.
Question right here.
First of all, thanks for a great panel. I also have a big question and a little question. I'll start with the big question. So to a certain extent, all of you talked about managing, regulating the environment or certain environmental aspects or events. To what extent is this state effort an effort to regulate the environment, and to what extent is it an effort to regulate people through the environment? I think you all touch on that a bit. Particularly, Cindy talks about how this is an episode in state efforts at centralization, but it might be useful to look through that other lens to consider what the state is really trying to do in all of these cases. In the case of cotton cultivation, does the state promotion of cotton cultivation, does the state believe that this will help it gain control of populations and promote the aims of empire? In the case of Corsica, it seems particularly apt in that case because, as you mentioned, Corsica is seen even by Napoleon, native Corsican, as being a place that is notoriously difficult to regulate. Because people just run into the Maquis and not pay their taxes. It seems to me that it's very likely that the effort to exploit Corsican timber, to promote agriculture there, is really to a large extent an effort to regulate and manage the Corsican population. At the very least, I think there's a lot of connection between the political and environmental sides, and that might be a way to bring it into your broader political study by looking through that lens. And then the smaller question is for Joshua. The accusations of environmental destruction that you mentioned with regard to the goats, the sheep, but particularly the goats. This is part of a much broader Mediterranean narrative, and I think it would be valuable for you to look at it to try and sort of deconstruct that narrative, and also to think about how does it play into these state aims of promoting centralization and power and sort of progress, which in this period is seen as making people sedentary, making people agricultural, controlling movement of people, and controlling the environment as a sort of byproduct of that.
Certainly. I mean, so one of there's a lot within the Corsican example, and one of the things that I kind of wish I would have been able to bring out is this idea of the Corsicans as the noble savage, right? And I think that is kind of an undercurrent when you look at the way the French view the Corsicans, in some ways as a lost cause, right? As like these guys are way behind everyone else, but then you do see well, it's our job to come in and help them and uplift, really. Essentially, it's a European uplift type scenario. So yeah, I mean, I think that is a big part of it. They are especially Foucault de Chateau. Looking at it from this Parisian perspective, looking at it as like these goats are a problem. Just really hating these goats, but viewing that as kind of saying the Corsicans who are letting these goats roam free. That's the bigger problem, right? That's the issue there. So yeah, I think that's definitely a really valuable line of inquiry.
Did you want to join?
I have a few. Am I cutting into people's lunch here? Maybe
no, we have a
little
couple
bit
more
over.
minutes.
Okay.
This will be the last question.
We'll talk about food, so you can't eat cotton. So, so I think that's an excellent question. In the case of cotton, you can see that regulation of people on kind of three levels. One, the whole continental system was basically about controlling the European economy, and Napoleon says this is about improving them, getting rid of these filthy Englishmen from the British or from the European continent, and then if the French can provide the things that the British are providing, all the better. So that's the primary motivation. If you look at the people that they tried to attract for the project, and this kind of goes to your comments as well, they're large landowners, typically who can afford to do these experiments, but these are the masses of granite. They're the people that Napoleon, the kind of established property owners that Napoleon hoped to use as the foundation to build his regime. So in many ways, this was an extension of what Napoleon called ralliement, the rallying of these people. Some, crypto-royalists, maybe some of them Jacobins, various kind of combinations of political interests, but maybe you can come together on this economic effort. The third element is Italy, which I don't talk much about here, but they had an extensive program throughout Piedmont, into Tuscany, and all the way to Rome. And Michael Browers has argued that that Napoleonic Italy is basically imperialism, an early example of European imperialism. And this is a contested thesis. I would argue that it is. I would be kind of sympathetic to his account. You see the French going in, conquering Italy, trying to promote cotton cultivation as a means of improving this kind of, as they see it, savage peninsula in a way similar to what they did, for example, in Algeria in the 1850s. They tried to grow cotton there. So I think you can see that that's a fascinating topic that could be a whole panel on its own. So I won't go much more into detail on that, but it's definitely about regulating people as well as regulating nature. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. We do have lunch, but
Sorry,
please,
Cindy.
please join me in thanking this terrific panel.